Hello, my name's Roger Watson and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education in Practice, and welcome to this session on the 4 rules of writing. This session is about how to get started with writing, how to keep going, and ultimately how to revise your manuscript and, with any luck, have it accepted by a good academic journal. Anyone who's tried to write knows that it can be difficult. It's not natural to sit down and write. It takes us away from the things that we want to do. We also get distracted very easily. Here's a chap looking out the window with a cup of coffee in his hand and a list of things down the side that can distract you. We get hungry, we want to go off and get something to eat. We want to get up and have a walk. We start playing about on our telephones and social media and so forth. My advice regarding these things is just to accept that they happen and try, when you are at your desk for however short a time, to write as much as possible in that time and to write as high quality material as possible in that time. We all get distracted. We can't write for prolonged periods. We just have to make the very best of the times that we have available. Anyone who wants to write should question why they want to write. Those of us who are academics have an obligation to write. We have an obligation to produce scholarship and research papers, and it's the one thing that distinguishes us from teachers. It's also very important for career progression. It's important in many countries for the prestige of your institution because the publications are used to judge the quality of the research that's been carried out there. Clearly, we want to share research findings and for those of us in clinical subjects to disseminate good practice. These things are all very well, and for some of them, directly and indirectly, it is possible to earn some money. That's not a huge motivator, I have to say. I always leave a space here, so this is separated out. You've got to ask yourself, do I write because I enjoy it? And my advice is, if you don't enjoy it, then you can learn to enjoy it by learning some strategies and some tactics for writing. I've said already, and I'll say it again, we can't write for prolonged periods. We need to write for short periods and to make the best use of those periods that we possibly can. Everyone who writes and publishes has overcome a barrier. As Dale Salwak said, behind every written piece there's a living, breathing human being who overcame his or her own challenges to express important thoughts on paper. These days, of course, increasingly it's not on paper, it's on screen, but you get the idea. That applies to a blog, to a letter in a newspaper, to a magazine article, a book, a chapter, or a scientific paper. Everyone has challenges and everyone has barriers to writing. You've got to identify yours and to consider how you can deal with them. The biggest barrier to writing is very easy to identify. It's time. None of us has enough time to write, and none of us will ever be given enough time to write. Those of us who are busy academics and clinicians, if we went to our manager and said, look, I'm about to write an article, can I have some time off to write it? I think that very few of us would get the answer yes. The answer is that you've got to try and work it into your working day, or even make some slight compromises with your own life in order to get things written. It is almost impossible, I don't like to say this, but it is a truth, and it's almost impossible to be a successful writer without that cutting into your own personal time. But it doesn't have to be much time. How about getting to your office half an hour earlier and doing some writing? How about curtailing your lunch break by half an hour and doing some writing then, if indeed you have a lunch break? How about staying in your office for an extra half an hour after you've finished? And how about in between things that you do where you may go and have a cup of coffee or not do anything very important? How about just sitting down and doing some writing in those times? If you dedicate frequent, short periods to writing, you will be amazed at the progress you make. And in fact, for busy academics and clinicians, it's almost the only way that you can write. I wouldn't advise anyone to seek prolonged periods for writing. Sabbaticals, weeks off, days off are usually not that effective. To be a writer, I'll use a lot of aphorisms from other writers. Stephen King, famous author, said if you want to be a writer, you must do two things above all others: read a lot and write a lot. And there's no way around these two things. There is no shortcut. So I'm not offering a shortcut either. It doesn't sound like much fun. We're not trying to give you an easy way to writing here, but there really is no shortcut, especially to sitting down and writing. You will not learn to write by listening to me here or by going to other writing workshops or reading about writing. All you'll get there are some ideas about how to do your writing better. Being a writer is about sitting down and writing. It's also very important to read a lot. Joanne Harris says, read as much as you can. To be a writer, you must be a reader. Comics, games, fan fiction, literary fiction, commercial fictions, children's books, e-books, magazines, non-fiction. It's all part of your training, and that counts for a novel writer, for a short story writer, an essayist, or for an academic writer. Any reading will help your writing. So please get into the habit of reading as much as possible. Norman Mailer said about writing, I learned to write by writing. I've already kind of said that, but it's very true. You only learn to write by writing, because by writing you learn what you're capable of, you learn how to pace yourself, you learn to get feedback on your writing, and you learn to improve. And you do get better. You learn to enjoy it, you begin to enjoy it, and you begin to see results. And I particularly like what he says next. Professionalism comes from being able to write on a bad day. We all do our clinical work, or our teaching, or our administrative work, without question when we go into work, but we use almost any excuse not to write. Being in a bad mood, not feeling 100%, having had an argument or whatever. We've really got to learn to overcome these things. We've really got to be able to learn to write on bad days. So there's a myth called the readiness myth. I'll write when I'm ready. I don't feel ready yet, but you will never feel ready. You really have to write before you feel ready. In other words, be professional about it. It's something that you want to do and that you should do. And if you're a committed academic or clinician, then it's something that you should be doing. So don't wait till you're ready. Don't wait till conditions are perfect. Do some writing. And as I say, it doesn't have to be much. Lord Beaverbrook was once asked about being a writer, and he said that you need to apply yourself to the job of writing, application to the job of writing. What he meant by this was apply the seat of your pants to the seat of a chair and don't get up until you've written something. Or, increasingly these days, some people stand at their desk, but you know what I mean. It means that you will not write anything unless you actually set aside some time to do it. But as I say again, don't look for hours and days to write. Try to grab half an hour and build up your writing that way. The occasional half hour, 20 minutes or so each day writing, or several times a day, will progress your writing much more than taking a week off or a whole day off or several hours off to write. So here's someone applying themselves to the job of writing. And you've really got to learn to write almost anywhere. So learn to write anywhere and everywhere. Clearly, sometimes you will write in your office. Sometimes you will write at home. Trains and planes are excellent places to write. You don't have to have a big desk necessarily. You can write on your phones or on an iPad. You don't need to be in your office or sitting at your favourite desk at home to write. And another great place to write is hotels. And we're often in hotels. We go to conferences and meetings. We often spend a lot of time by ourselves. I'm not suggesting that we spend all of that writing, but if you're away from work for a conference or for some work-related reason, you are not on holiday. So I would get out of the habit every time you're away from your office of putting out an out-of-office reply, unless you're genuinely on holiday and genuinely unavailable. Get out of the habit of making yourself unavailable and seem as if you're not really working when you're away on work-related trips and visits and conferences and so forth. And I can assure you that will help you to make progress with your writing. To some extent, it's a state of mind. Joanne Harris said, get headspace. Many writers don't have the luxury of a room of their own. They may write in airports, hotel rooms, or railway stations. Keep a notebook. Maybe not necessarily in the shower, but I would definitely keep a notebook to note down ideas. Well, having said that, don't write too much on paper, because transcribing it is quite a lengthy and tedious process. But try to keep your ideas close, try to note them down. You don't have to have a notebook, you can write them down on your phone, for example, in the notes part of your phone. But it's also quite nice to have a pen and paper handy to note things down and structure things and get your ideas down. So always have a notebook close at hand for those ideas that go through your head, for things that you may want to write or add to what you're writing. If you don't, and especially as you get older, you will forget them. And once you've got them down, you're free to think of the next idea. So Joanne Harris again says, keep a notebook. Carry it with you at all times. In it, record anything you see or hear that you find interesting, new, striking, shocking, funny, or singular. Anything that's relevant to your writing and that may stimulate your writing. Now some don'ts regarding writing. Don't think about it. Thinking about writing is not writing, it's thinking, even if it is thinking about writing. We're all guilty of this. We intend to do some writing. We can't really be bothered doing it, so we think, well, we'll spend some time thinking about it, planning the article out, getting some ideas. The problem is that we don't think about it because we get distracted, and we can't think about it in the way that we want to, because you can only hold so many ideas in your head at one time, and the only way that you can get those ideas out of your head in a constructive way is to write them down. Then you can forget about them. They're on paper or on the computer, and you've freed your mind up to have the next set of ideas. That's what writing's about. We often actually don't know, as I'm going to point out later, what we're going to write about till we start writing. So don't think about it. Do some writing. I've already said, and I'll reiterate, it doesn't have to be a long time. Short, quality times are far better. Don't think about it. Don't tell anyone about it. All the people who tell me they're going to write something usually don't write anything. When someone tells you that they're going to write something, they're doing two things. One, they're trying to deflect and make you think that they're writing something, even if they're not, and they're storing up some stress for themselves in the future, because I'm going to come back and ask them if they've written it, and when they haven't, then it starts again. So don't bother telling anyone that you're going to write something. Go off and write it, show them what you've written. And again, don't worry how good or bad it is, just show them what you've written. That's far more impressive, but you're not just out to impress people, you're out to make progress. And that's how you make progress. Don't wait for inspiration. It actually never comes. This is related to thinking about it, of course, but this is much more passive. It's waiting for ideas to come to you. They don't. As the Nike advert says, just do it. Put pen to paper, delay no more. Remember, you can edit a bad page, but you can't edit a blank page. Blank pages of paper or on the computer are the enemy of the writer. Once you've written something, no matter how bad it is, you can edit it. It's there, and nobody can take it away from you. All the inspiration you need is the act of drawing the chair up to the writing table. That's inspiration. That's the inspired step in writing. Now, this picture conveys to me something else that you shouldn't do, but many people do, and that is to surround themselves with all the articles printed out and marked up that they want to use for whatever piece of writing they're doing. This is not a good tactic. What happens is that you become determined to chisel everything that you've read into what you're writing. Your writing doesn't flow, it becomes disjointed, you spend too much time reading, and ultimately you run the danger of not writing what you want to write and writing what other people have already written. I'm not saying necessarily plagiarism, but you're trying to copy that style or try to make things look the same. By all means, do some reading first. You may well have to. I would strongly advise you to put these papers or the PDFs on your desktop away, close them down, get rid of them, sit there with a cleaner desk. By all means, have some music or your biscuits or your hand cream or whatever else is on the desk there. But write what you want to write. Write down the ideas you've got about whatever it is, and that includes scientific papers, and then go back and make sure that you can support the points you've made with the literature that you've read. It's a far better tactic. So I'll say again, don't surround yourself by all the manuscripts, either virtually on the screen or in hard copy. It doesn't help to get on and make progress with writing. So Dale Salbuck said, instead of planning or talking about your plan, just get something out on paper or on a screen before you forget it, no matter how uncertain you feel or how confusing it sounds. Remember, when you write something, the first draft is for you only. Nobody else is going to read it. Don't be embarrassed by it. Don't erase it. Don't get rid of it. Keep it there and work on it. He also suggests writing your first draft before you do any research. Now, that's the equivalent of what I said in the previous slide. I don't mean don't do any research. Clearly, if you're writing research papers, you will have had to do the research. But don't worry too much about reading all the articles that may inform it. Get something down that you want to write. Start that sort of framework from your head and build the rest of the article around it. And this is very true. Usually we don't know what we're going to write about until we've written our first stumbling draft. I know this from writing blogs, which I do regularly and I'm asked to do regularly. I'm given a vague idea. Rather than trying to plan it all out, I often just start writing and the ideas come. That's the way that writing tends to work. So those are some other ideas on inspiration related to writing. And as you can see, all of them are very active steps, not passive. So first drafts don't have to be perfect, they just have to be written. One trick that I've found, or one strategy, when I'm writing an article is to start with a blank Word document. That's where you always have to start. Give it a title, and if you don't have a clear title, just write title or a vague title. Put in a page break using Control-Alt on your computer. Put in a title abstract. Do the same again. Put introduction. Do the same again with a page break, background, then results, conclusion, discussion, references, and so forth. You get the idea. What you do then is, from a blank document, create something with about 12 or so words in it. You've made a start. And then don't forget to save that article and to back it up. Always back up everything that you're writing. Don't take chances. Don't carry too much about on pen drives or just on your laptop. Make sure that you've got a cloud storage or a hard drive, an external hard drive or something, but try to keep more than one copy of what you've written. There's nothing more tragic than losing your writing. So here we are, the 4 rules of writing at last. These are: read the guidelines, set realistic targets and count words, seek criticism, and probably the most important one, provided you've written something, is treat a rejection as the start of the next submission. Never give up. All the best writers and academics I know say when they have a paper rejected, where's it going next? And you will be rejected. We've got to learn to live with that. So using Nurse Education Practice My Journal, but all journals have this feature in common. They have an area on the landing page which is Guide for Authors. You must check the guidance and write to that guidance. The guidelines will tell you the length of the article. You don't have to meet that length, but it gives you some idea of the parameters that you're aiming for. What the layout should look like, usually double-spaced, fairly wide margins, a reasonably large font. Get these things right at the beginning. Make it look like an academic article right from the beginning. Don't leave it to the end to sort all this out. Nothing looks worse, and we do get articles as editors with changes of font, changes of spacing. It just looks terrible. Make it look as nice as you possibly can. Get the organization right. That's what I was talking about a couple of slides ago. The organization is the headings, the title, the abstract, and so forth. Get that right in the right order. Make sure that the journal wants those headings. Sometimes they only want an introduction, sometimes only a background, sometimes both, sometimes neither. Make sure that you follow the organization. And once you've got the organization of the paper right, it becomes easier to write because you can fill in the gaps within the organization of the paper. Don't feel obliged to start at the beginning and work your way through to the end. If you've got an idea for the discussion while you're writing up the methods, go down to the discussion and put that idea in. And also pay attention to the referencing system. So a typical order of contents would be title, abstract, introduction, background, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and references. Try to write to whatever target of words you've got. That's coming up next. But write within these areas of your manuscript. Use the organization to build up the manuscript. Once you've got the organization, the analogy I like to use here is of stacking the shelves. Simply write into the shelves which are provided by the organization of the paper. I see the discussion section as one of the shelves which you need to populate. So use the organization to help you write the paper. So create a document with the appropriate headings, write under whatever heading you wish, and end each session with bullet points. In other words, if you've still got ideas in your head, don't try to complete them, don't forget about them, put them down as bullet points, and that gives you something to pick up when you next start writing. Setting targets, the second of the 4 rules. All good writers do it. My advice is to try to write a specific number of words every day or every time you sit down to write. Whatever that target is, don't get up until you've written it. My personal target is 500 words each time I sit down to write. I try to write every day, but I don't always manage, but I try never to start writing and finish without getting that target achieved, those 500 words. When you've reached your target, stop. Don't try to go beyond it because you'll become discouraged. And that's the point at which, if you've still got ideas in your head, to put them down as bullet points. And that gives you a natural place to pick up the thread when you start writing the next time. There's nothing worse than not knowing where to start or what to write. This helps you to keep going. So don't lose those ideas. Use them as an instrument to get going the next time you open up the article, clearly until it's in its first draft and complete. So Philip Hodgson says, set daily targets, stick to them, and give yourself plenty of rewards afterwards. But I really like this phrase, the people who succeed are those who treat it like a job. Try to keep writing close to you. Don't make it remote. Don't make it fearful or difficult, or ever get into the impression it's something you can't do. Everyone can write. It's not necessarily an inherent skill, but it's a skill that you can get better at by practice. So treat it like a job. Do your clinical work, do your teaching, do your administrative work, and do some writing. Work it into your daily life. Joanne Harris says, getting into the groove. However much or little time you have, try to write something every day. I couldn't agree more. The third rule of writing, seek criticism. Find a critical friend. Somebody who will help you to see the flaws in your writing. They don't have to be an expert. Almost anyone will do. Anybody who says to you, I don't understand what that means, is helping you to make your writing better. But also people who will pick up grammatical errors and show you where things need to be moved and changed, and people who will actually indicate specifically where those things need to be done. General criticism of your writing, that this is really great or this is no good, are not helpful. But you'll soon learn what kind of people will give you the best advice. So not this sort of person who always tells you everything's wrong and is aggressive about it. Not the person who always gives you a big hug and tells you everything's great, because it's not in your writing. You can always improve it. But someone who's been there and hopefully will give you a helping hand to make your writing better. Moreover, you have to learn when you become an experienced writer to do these things for other people and to do it quickly. One of the worst type of people to ask is somebody who never gives it back to you. So you'll soon learn which people do that, but don't become one of those people yourself. Expect to have several revisions. James Michener was asked if he was one of the world's greatest writers. He says, no, I'm one of the world's greatest rewriters. How many drafts you have really depends on what you're writing and maybe how many people you're writing with. But you do get better. As you get better, you will have fewer drafts. Learn when to let go. There's nothing worse than holding on to your writing. Have some courage. Once you've written it, revised it, sought some criticism, and taken that criticism into account, and then left it for maybe a few days, don't send things off immediately. It's always good to leave them, come back to them one last time for any final changes. It's ready to go then. You've got to send it out to a journal, to an editor, and get their view on it. Don't be afraid. Some people are, but it's just part of what we do. As an academic, you've got to accept the criticism and, including on occasions, rejection. Have a strategy around your writing. Have a plan of action which helps you to achieve something in the long term. But of course, that's made up of short-term goals which you've got to set your mind to. I envisage this as establishing a production line. Here's a production line for a bicycle, which is not quite the same, of course, but you get the idea that you've got a one-way process for your articles. They come in at one end with the raw ideas, then they're written, they're drafted, and then finally they're sent off for publication. This helps you to prioritize your writing. So do prioritize your writing. Keep deliberate notes, perhaps on a whiteboard or even on your iPhone. Somewhere have priorities. Know what you're working on next and know what your priorities are, and reorganize those priorities as things change. So always prioritize drafts over new manuscripts. If you're drafting a manuscript and you're halfway through it, don't get distracted by doing another one. Don't get too distracted by someone else coming along and saying, I've got a great idea for a manuscript. Get on with the one you're doing or you may not get it finished. So prioritize drafts over new manuscripts. And always prioritize revisions over drafts. No matter what you're doing, if an article's been out for review and it comes back with a request for revision, that is your next job. Get those revisions done. Don't put them to the bottom of the pile. And moreover, and most importantly, always do them. If you're asked to revise an article, you are 90% of the way there. It hasn't been rejected. They're interested. They're asking you to make some improvements. Do it, and you will almost certainly be published. In terms of a strategy for publication, aim at a cluster of journals. This is just an idea here, but you may want to look at prestige versus generic to specialized journals, but always have a cluster of journals which you're aiming at. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you start at the top in terms of impact factor and work your way down. That doesn't always work, and it can involve you in a lot of work and a lot of rejection, but it also doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't try high quality journals, but always have a plan B and potentially a plan C in mind. Have an idea of where you're aiming when you're writing and then submitting a manuscript. And I would always recommend, related to checking the guidelines, that you do have a journal in mind when you write your manuscript. Dealing with reviewers' comments, well, I advise you to apply the golden rules of Williams. These are: answer completely, answer politely, and answer with evidence. They're quite simple, quite straightforward and obvious, but they're often not done. So answer completely means deal with every point even if you don't agree or can't change it. Never ignore a point that an editor or a reviewer has raised. That's almost a guaranteed way to be rejected. So please make sure that every point that's raised is dealt with, and if you don't agree with it, you've got to make a comment about why. Try to make a list of points even if you're not presented with a list. So sometimes editors and reviewers will be helpful and bullet point or number the points they give back to you. Sometimes they won't, they will just write a narrative. In either case, and especially in the latter, it's your job to pull out what you see as being the main points and addressing them and showing them that you've addressed them. One of the best ways to do this is to provide the editors with a table with the point that's being made, the page it's on, the change that you've made, make a comment about that and the page that's been made on. Another really good idea here is to make the changes in the manuscript in red font. Never track them in, that doesn't work for editing. You mustn't use tracking, but make them in red font. That does two things. It makes the editor aware that you've addressed the points. It won't necessarily go back to the reviewers, but it makes the editors or the reviewers, if they're looking at it, aware that you've done those points and addressed them. And also it draws their attention to those points and helps them to focus on that points, and it prevents them from having to read the manuscript all the way through from beginning to end and perhaps finding some other points. They shouldn't do that, but it sometimes happens. So most journals will allow you to use red font or some coloured font to make the changes. If they don't make any comment about it, then make sure you do that. It's very useful for you, it's very useful for the editors and for the reviewers. Answer politely. Don't start with "we completely disagree with the comments of the reviewer" or "who on earth are you reviewers?" There's no need for this. Comments can sometimes seem strange, they can sometimes seem quite difficult to deal with, but be under no illusion. If you've got a paper back for revision, it means the door is open. So try to get through that and be polite. In fact, go out of your way to be polite. Thank you very much for the reviewers' comments. We really appreciate it. We hadn't taken that point into consideration. This is a great improvement. You know, it's a dialogue. Try and take part in that dialogue politely. We try to make sure that our reviewers are polite. We also try to make sure that authors are polite in turn. And answer with evidence. This is back to the point of where you can't necessarily make a change. Provide evidence, provide them with facts, provide them with references. It's almost never the case that if you don't address a point in the way that they want you to address it, but you give some reasoned response, that you don't get accepted. So don't worry about this. Don't worry if you can't deal with a point or it's contradictory or something. Just try to deal with it as best you can. So finally, I would strongly advise you to check out Nurse, Author and Editor, edited by Leslie Nichol on behalf of the International Academy of Nursing Editors, the INANE group. This is free, it's free to access, and it's also supported by the publishers Wiley, and you can subscribe to it in the sense of having alerts, but the content is there for everyone to read. This is mainly written by editors, and it's got all sorts of useful advice about all aspects of publishing, including details about writing papers. For example, how to write an introduction, how to start a discussion section. Very prosaic things that many writers get stuck with. But it also contains other articles and advice on open access, open science, writing for blogs, that kind of thing, use of social media. So do check out Nurse, Author and Editor, it's free. That's my email address if you've any questions or comments. There's my ORCID number. You can check that out and see my own record of publications and research. You can follow me on Twitter or you can follow me on WeChat. I hope you found this session useful. Thank you very much for listening.